I met Lila Monroe on a drizzly April evening in Seattle, under the awning of a scone shop that smelled like cinnamon and rain. I'd been walking home from a code review that ran too long. My hair damp and my shoulders carrying the kind of tired that only insomnia can scale. She was arguing, politely, fiercely, with a barista about a missing donation jar. Her hands moved like punctuation, her laugh cut through the soft jazz in the corner. When she noticed me staring, she offered a grin that felt like a dare. I was 38 then, working as a senior software engineer at a mid-sized cloud services company downtown. My title sounded dull on paper, but I liked the work. The logic of systems. The quiet satisfaction when a deployment didn't break the world. My salary at the time was $110,000. Comfortable enough to rent a 2-bedroom in Capitol Hill, pay student loans without panic, and occasionally splurgeo. And a good bottle of wine. Lila was 30-4, if I remember correctly, and she worked as a policy director for a regional nonprofit that advocated for labor rights. Her salary was around $145,000. She told me once, over takeout sushi, that having money matters because it buys you choices. She said it without shame and with a kind of practiced precision that made it sound like truth. Framed in an argument, we started dating because she asked me out flatly. "You look like someone who'd prefer to be at the library than in a dive bar," she said when I told her I was happy to avoid the weekend crowds. I liked that she noticed small truths. The early months were a collage of easy things. Reading in bed until the clock said 3 a.m. Long walks where we argued about policy papers and indie films. The way she would hold a coffee mug like it was evidence for an argument about the virtue of hot hands. I came to appreciate not just her convictions but the way her convictions organized her life. Meetings, volunteer slots, late-night calls with reporters. She had a calendar that looked like a manifesto. Lila's friends were a directory of sharp people doing sharp things. There was Priya, a nurse who taught public health courses at the community college and who loved karaoke with a sincerity that made you grin. Jonah, Lila's college friend who worked in municipal government and could find a regulation in 2 seconds flat. And Elena, her deputy at the nonprofit. Calm, wry, a patient counterweight to Lila's storms. My friends were quieter. Tasha, my coworker and project manager, loved weekend hackathons and whiskey. Mark, from grad school, had become a high school math teacher who could still beat anyone at Scrabble. Between our social circles there was overlap. The kind that fills rooms with different kinds of energy and occasionally sparks fights that make you learn new vocabulary for forgiveness. We were married 2 years after meeting, in a small ceremony at the Seattle Art Museum. Rain threatened the whole afternoon and then splashed down exactly during our vows, making the city's glass dome glow. Lila wore her hair loose. A small wildness at odds with the degree of control she exercised in most of her life. She wrote her own vows, I wrote mine. Mine were practical. Promises to keep her coffee hot when she needed it. To listen when she needed space. To try always to be kind. Hers read like a note to history, brave, idealistic, sweeping. I loved her vows and the moral scaffolding they implied. We both believed we were building something that would make the world a little better and, selfishly, make our small corner of it steadier. The first years were good in the way that stable marriages are, steady but not always cinematic. Lila's work escalated. Her nonprofit landed a high-visibility campaign defending local organizers who faced legal retaliation. And with that campaign came donors, consultants, op-eds, and an invitation to testify before the state legislature. Her public voice sharpened into a bone. Colleagues would text her with praise. I was proud. I went to hearings wearing a neat blazer and a nervous smile and listened while she testified with a calm that made my chest both swell and ache. But the spotlight changed her rhythm. She began to keep a separate version of herself for public consumption. Crisp quotes. Measured indignation. A Twitter account that threaded righteous calls to action with the occasional personal anecdote. On panels, she had a knack for turning complex policy into plain sentences that packed moral weight. People started tagging her in posts as a thought leader. It was flattering and, over time, expensive in small ways I didn't expect. At first the costs were small. Missed dinners because she had to prep for a speech. A text unread because she was live streaming a community meeting. I told myself these were temporary, the price of public work. Lila was unambiguous about her priorities. She worked for causes that mattered. But something in the private economy of two people began to shift. The exchange of small attentions that keeps intimacy breathing started to feel transactional. She'd say, "I gave an hour to this hotline last night," and I'd answer, "You did great," and then I'd wait for the reciprocal care when I came home exhausted. Sometimes it came, sometimes it didn't. Once, after a 12-hour sprint debugging a production issue that had woken me at 3 in the morning, I came home to an empty apartment and a post on her feed thanking the team that had worked through the night. The photo had my silhouette in it, uncredited, a shadow in the background. It was public affirmation stacked against private erasures. Lila had a moral clarity that could feel like conviction and, at times, like judgment. She operated from a sense of principle that didn't tolerate equivocation. That energy propelled her to victories. It also made her impatient with ambiguity. In private, if I suggested we delegate a household chore, she'd sometimes answer with a lecture on the hidden costs of labor and then, midway through, suggest I was being complacent. The nuance got lost in the force with which she delivered it. I knew she wanted fairness. I just wanted the fairness to be accessible instead of preached. Small slights accumulated into larger ones. She began to correct me publicly at dinners. On grammar. On the ethics of a company someone at the table had invested in. On a comment about policy that I made half-jokingly. The worst moments were like truth given a scalpel. Her corrections were accurate, but they landed like blows because they came with no room for the learning curve. Once, at a fundraiser where she'd been a keynote, I mentioned a podcast's recent take on urban planning and she laughed in a way that made the room tilt. "Marcus," she said loudly, "you keep recommending these things without interrogating their assumptions. It's performative." I looked around and saw people looking at me the way you see a student being called out in class. I felt, in that instant, like a specimen of insufficient politics rather than a partner. We tried counseling after a particularly nasty winter where we spent more nights in silence than not. Dr. Levy, a therapist recommended by Priya, suggested we practice companionable reciprocity, a term that made us both laugh at first. The counseling helped in places. Lila learned to ask about my day without immediately updating me on policy failures that evening. I learned to be clearer about the kinds of support I needed that didn't require ideological alignment. For a while, that practice worked. We agreed to small rituals. A text at noon if the day was rough. A weekly phone call with my mother on Sunday nights. These were scaffolds of care, little promises that built habits. But habits are not ironclad. Old patterns reasserted themselves, particularly when the world fed her need to be right. A public mistake, the kind that happens when a tweet is clipped or a quote is taken out of context, sent her into a defensive spiral. She would respond by being sharper, more exacting, less forgiving. The persona that had once been necessary now became armor. When she was on the defensive, she became quick to find fault at home. as if domestically recalibrating the balance of power could make up for professional bruises. The moment that finally ruptured everything was not as dramatic as an affair or a betrayal. It was a small, almost mundane scene that somehow boiled over. We had friends over for dinner, Priya, Jonah, and Mark, celebrating my promotion to engineering lead. I'd been working towards it for years and in the interim had taken on leadership roles. Convinced the team through late nights and listening. I was proud. I set the table with more care than usual because I wanted the evening to feel like a marker. Early in the night, Lila dominated the conversation, as she sometimes did, sitting at the head with a drink in one hand and an anecdote on the tip of her tongue. She told a story about a protest she had organized, a success that had led to policy concessions from a stubborn agency. When the subject turned to leadership and sacrifice, Lila, without warning, made a joke. "Marcus is really the domestic one between us," she said, chuckling. "The one who keeps the home hearth while I fight the good fight." Bless him. The room laughed politely. It was meant, I think, as gentle ribbing. But the tone she used blinded the room with a particular kind of social hierarchizing. She was, in effect, praising herself for moral labor while making mine look quaint. I felt my smile harden. Later, when it was quiet, I asked her about it. "Why do you talk about me like I'm a side project?" I asked. It was a soft question, but she answered with a tone I knew. The righteous indifference of someone who believed that calling something out was inherently kind. "I'm not doing it to diminish you," she said. "I'm just being honest about what we each bring. You have your work. I have mine. Honesty is good," I thought, but honesty tethered to a hierarchy that coded support as lesser is not kindness. From there the rifts grew like vines. She started publicly praising me in ways that made me feel like an adjunct to her narrative. Instagram posts with me fitting into a captioned role. A LinkedIn shoutout where I was the supportive partner behind the scenes. The performance bothered me not because recognition is a bad thing but because recognition without understanding felt like a portrait painted by someone who admired the idea of you more than you. In private she would say, "I'm proud of you," but it was often accompanied by a privacy-emptying addendum. "You don't talk about your work much. You should share more." Sharing more, for me, meant writing code that was readable, mentoring junior engineers, and quiet emails that saved someone's day. Her public declarations about me framed those things as lesser. Our fights started to harden around language. She would use phrases like "complicity of comfort" at breakfast and expect me to respond with a critique. I genuinely tried to meet her in the spaces she cared about. I attended workshops, read essays she recommended, spoke at a panel about the ethics of software when asked. But learning is different from living inside a moral architecture where every move is audited. The fracture came fully into light during an awards night where Lila was receiving recognition for her community work. She asked me to come as her guest. I wore the suit, rehearsed a congratulatory smile, and when they called her name I stood and applauded. After the speech, during the champagne toasts, a reporter asked Lila, on a whim, about the role of partners in activism. She smiled the kind of smile I'd come to know as both warm and weaponized. And then said, loud enough for the room, "Some people live their politics. Others perform them. I'm grateful Marcus lives quietly ethical. He's comfortable letting me be the moral engine." The applause was warm. The microphones picked up her phrasing. And when we left the hall my chest felt like someone had removed the soft lining. We argued in the cab home, the city lights blurring like questions. I said her comment made me feel invisible. She said there was no harm in her characterization. I said being praised as a virtue signified you were not seen. And that sometimes praise was a way not to connect. She said I was being petty. We both slept on opposite sides of the bed with the kind of fatigue that permeates bone. I decided, in that quiet, that I would no longer be a peripheral image in her public story. I started to pull away a little, not in order to spite her but because I needed boundaries. I said no to promoting certain posts. I declined requests to appear in photo shoots framed as partnership narratives, and I stopped letting her editorialize my private life without consent. The withdrawal felt necessary. It also felt like a grief for something ineffable. The loss of the person who had first loved me without turning me into a lesson. Lila did not take my distance well. She saw it as disloyalty, a withdrawal from the movement. In her mind, our lives were already political because they were committed. My setting boundaries felt like abdication. She intensified her public commitments. And in private she became sharper. Argumentative in small ways that once would have been tender. She called me complacent. I called her hurtful. We both dug trenches. There were attempts at repair. Friend Jonah suggested another round of counseling. Dr. Levy suggested different language exercises. We tried to rebuild the scaffolding. Date nights. An agreement to discuss public posts before posting about each other. A decision to make space for the other's career. For a time, there was progress. Lila learned to ask me if she could mention me in a post and to stop making jokes that reified a hierarchy. But old habits have a muscle memory of their own. The last decisive moment came on a Saturday morning when a local radio station invited Lila to do a live segment about workplace equity. I had planned to join her for breakfast. She asked me to come and I said yes. Halfway through the segment, a host, cheeky, eager, asked about the emotional cost borne by partners of activists. Lila told a story that included me. A story about a time I had refused to attend a protest because my work had been overwhelming. She framed it as evidence of the quiet burdens partners take. The story itself was not untrue. I had stayed home that night. But the way she told it, smiling into the microphone, with a pause that suggested moral complexity, made me sound like a man who was insufficiently committed. The clincher was when she ended the anecdote with, "I'm grateful Marcus held it down at home." The phrase, delivered on air, made me feel like an accessory. I walked out of the studio without waiting for the post-show drinks. She chased me down the block, hair shaking, asking, breathless, how I could leave, how I could be so dramatic. I said, "I'm tired of being framed as an accessory. I'm tired of living in your narrative." She said I was being selfish. I said I was being honest. The argument bent into something irreparable. We separated not because I wanted to punish her but because my identity had been eclipsed in a narrative that loved an idea more than a person. Lila moved out to take a fellowship in Washington, D.C. I stayed in our Seattle apartment, subletted the second bedroom, and found a new rhythm. Divorce followed within a year. It was not vindictive or scandalous, it was a legal procedure that dissolved a household. We split our books and our spoons with the care of people who once cared and who now wanted clean edges. Simone, our aging golden retriever, stayed with me until she died. Lila called sometimes. We sent occasional emails about mutual friends. She crashed, in ways public platforms tend not to capture. The fellowship in D.C. was intense and isolating. She encountered critiques she hadn't anticipated and allies who asked probing questions. One evening, 3 years after the separation, I received an email from Elena. She forwarded a note from Lila, short and a little raw. "Can we talk?" Not for headlines. For me. Elena added, gently, that Lila had been in therapy for some time and that she was trying to be more mindful. Conversation with Lila was, for a while, like listening to someone learning a language of regret. She spoke about the pattern she had replicated. How she folded people into principle and then left them outside of her private life. She said she'd been reading about attachment styles and how certain kinds of moral certainty can mask fear. I think I thought that if I was unyielding in public, it would protect me from being vulnerable privately, she said once over coffee. I used my righteousness as a buffer. I'm sorry it meant I buffered you out. The apology was not theatrical. It was consistent and came with a ledger of small changes. Calls to my mother on birthdays without a social post. Volunteer commitments that weren't broadcast. A several-month hiatus from panels to do listening sessions in communities without her mic. She returned some of the photos I had wanted back, asked for additions she could not post, and started practicing the art of quiet care. Bringing soup to a neighbor without a photo. Fixing a leaky faucet at an elderly volunteer's home. Showing up to a friend's funeral with flowers and no hair on the camera. The regret she expressed was deep. She said she missed the everydayness of being loved for the small things. The way my cooking could be consolatory. The time I would wake up in the night to rearrange a blanket. She said she regretted weaponizing righteousness to make herself feel safer. In a way, I envied her. The ability to see one's own patterns and try to change takes courage. But I'd also build a new life. I'd married again. This time to Renee. A product designer with a soft laugh and a better way of folding laundry than anyone I'd ever known. Renee and I had a home where arguments happened over dirty dishes and not over whose identity validated the other. Our fights were mundane and redeemable. Lila dated as well. Sometimes we'd touch base. Once, on an October evening, she sent a long message about how she had started volunteering at a neighborhood shelter not as photo op but because she found it grounding. Small practices, she wrote, are where bold ideals get tested into real care. She added, more quietly, I was wrong to make you a footnote in my story. You deserved more than subtext. That was true. I had also wronged her by enabling the performance and not always naming how it made me feel. Relationships were rarely one-sided in responsibility. I had remained silent at moments I could have said, this feels like humiliation, and my silence had allowed a damaging dynamic to calcify. When you live with someone who is brilliant and convinced and in need, sometimes you conflate endurance with love. I learned, after we separated, the difference between being patient and being erased. Years later, Lila established a small fellowship aimed at training grassroots organizers in personal sustainability, a program that emphasized community care and private boundaries with as much seriousness as public strategy. She invited me, once, to come speak about building sustainable careers in tech, but I declined. My role had shifted to mentoring junior engineers who were navigating the ethics of impact. We both found ways to influence differently. When she told me she regretted losing me, it was less a plea than an assessment. She had lost a partner who wanted to be visible on his own terms. Who wanted to be loved without being made into a symbol. She had built, in service of a public fight that mattered, an armor that kept out the very tenderness she wanted. Her regret was the slow regret of someone who realized that single-mindedness can produce many small casualties. I forgave her, which is not to say I returned to what we had. Forgiveness freed me from anger and left room for compassion. Lila's work continued. It was better because she had learned to attend to people privately. She learned to be tedious and small and lovely. Checking in with the baristas she'd once lectured. Showing up to an amateur theater performance without an agenda. Bringing soup to a neighbor's stoop without a selfie. The story is not tidy. We both keep parts of what we were. Lila's public voice remains sharp. My work still values quiet infrastructure. The city moves around us. New campaigns rise and fall. But there are small practices now. Calls that aren't performative. Apologies that aren't press ready. And a recognition that loving people well sometimes looks less like proclamation and more like showing up for the dishes. If there's a lesson I took from our years, it is this: passion without tenderness can become a kind of tyranny. Lila's feminism was a real asset to the world. Her advocacy saved jobs and changed hearts. Yet in private she had sometimes used the language of justice to avoid intimacy. She learned, painfully, that the microscale of relationships matters. Making someone feel seen and valued daily is an act of justice as important as any public policy. Her regret was a chastened, honest thing, a catalog that became fuel for better practices. We did not get a romantic reunion, and maybe that's okay. We got something rarer, an honest accounting and two lives nudged by the friction of having loved and having hurt. Lila's regret changed her. It did not erase the past, but it made the present kinder. And for me, that kind of change, slow, consistent, and private, is a kind of victory I did not know I wanted until I saw it manifest in the small, unglamorous things.